me tell you one other thing about whether you should be listening to me at all. When I was asked to come to this conference, I was asked to write a one-page summary of what would happen under the new administration, and I think you have that in your book, and it's about Hillary Clinton. So that should tell you something about the depth of the surprise in the United States about Mr. Trump's victory. This was not something that was expected by Democrats. It was not something that was expected by Republicans. So all of us are in a state of a bit of shock about this transpiring. So I want to say three things. I want to say something about the election itself and the way that will affect foreign policy. And then I want to say something about Mr. Trump's foreign policy ideas, which are still quite vague. And then I want to say a few things about the Korean Peninsula and some of the things that come out of his campaign, and in part extend some assurances to Korea, because I think the departures from past policy will probably be somewhat less than are thought. So first, on the election itself, I want to focus on the election briefly because it's important for one aspect of U.S. foreign policy, namely its trade policy. And if you followed the election closely, you notice that Mr. Trump's victory was a result of him winning Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Wisconsin. And in those states, what happened was that white working class voters, which had previously split their votes between the Republican and Democratic Party, moved to Trump very dramatically. And the reason that's important is because the ability of the United States to lead on trade issues in a Trump administration is going to be severely affected. And I would say at this juncture, TPP is probably dead. Whether he can reverse his position on it, it will be interesting to see. We've learned that Prime Minister Abe is going to visit New York to see Mr. Trump. And of course, one of the things he's going to be talking about is TPP. So right from the start, trade issues are going to face a new Trump administration, but I think the election makes it difficult for the U.S. to move on that score. Now, I should also say that unlike Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump does not have a deep foreign policy staff, so we don't know what their views on the Korean Peninsula might be. But we do have a very important speech which he gave in Philadelphia in September, which I think outlines some of the core ideas of how he'll approach the Asia-Pacific. And what is striking about that speech is its emphasis on the buildup of the American military. This is going to be a foreign policy approach which in its first instance centers to a significant degree on expanding U.S. military spending, which has been constant in nominal dollars, but has actually fallen some under the Obama administration, partly because of the winding down of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but partly because spending has been constrained. And if you look at that speech, he talks about a significant expansion of the Navy in particular. And whenever you hear the word Navy in American military policy, of course, it's referring in large part to the Asia-Pacific, because that's where those forces would be deployed. Now, a second feature of that speech, which is worth noting, is a particular attention that he put on building up ballistic missile defense capabilities. And again, this is a military point, but I think it's relevant, obviously, for the Korean Peninsula. You're likely to see a Trump administration put emphasis on cooperation between Korea, Japan, and the United States on BMD issues. And so the THAAD deployment is just the beginning of a discussion of a deeper BMD connection in Northeast Asia, as well as in Europe, I should add. Now, there's a contradictory feature to Mr. Trump's foreign policy in that he believes in a very large military, or he says he does, but it's not clear exactly how he would use it. And curiously, he's been quite cautious about foreign interventions. He's on the record as being opposed to the U.S. intervention in Iraq, though he supported it at the time. He's been critical of the Obama administration intervention in Libya. He's willing to work with the Russians on ISIS. I think he is cautious in terms of actually intervening. And so how you put together a large military buildup with caution with respect to actually intervening abroad is something that is puzzling to those who are watching what he said. Now, we do have several hints. Two of his advisors wrote a piece 3 days ago in Foreign Policy that talked about some of his ideas, and those ideas were critical of the pivot to Asia, in part because it wasn't muscular enough. And so, for example, this article criticized the way that the Obama administration had handled Scarborough Shoals, and it even talked about arming Taiwan more aggressively. So we see a large military buildup, caution with respect to intervention, but then on the other hand, a willingness to be somewhat more forward on issues in the Asia-Pacific. Now, let me say just a few more things that come out of the campaign, and frankly, these are by way of assurance to our allies. Number one, there were casual comments made during the campaign about nuclear weapons, and it's important to recognize that Mr. Trump himself later denied that he had made those comments. And he did, in fact, make them, but the fact that he denied that he made them means that the U.S. will continue to expect that Japan and South Korea abide by their commitments under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. A Trump administration is not an invitation to create nuclear-armed Japan or South Korea. Second, on the alliances themselves, I think that Trump is a businessman and he likes to portray himself as a bargainer. And the comments he's made about the alliances have to do ultimately with money. And so after the current basing agreement runs out in 2018, you can expect the United States to be bargaining hard with respect to burden sharing on the troops that are deployed here. But I think it's highly unlikely that the U.S. is going to pull forces out of South Korea, given the fact that it's committed to a position of strength in the Asia-Pacific. So one thing that South Korea should be thinking about is, if it's paying more, what does it want in return? And this may even be an opportunity for South Korea to put its own issues on the table in the alliance. And then finally, let me say a word about chorus and say a few things about appointments. During the campaign, Mr. Trump made the incautious statement that he would rip chorus up. And of course, he doesn't have the power to do that. That's a treaty, in effect, which has been ratified by both houses of Congress. So if the United States can't lead on trade, it's not the case that Mr. Trump is going to be able to reverse the achievement of the bilateral free trade agreement between Korea and the United States. And so finally, before I turn to Scott, let me just emphasize that we really don't know very much. As I said, with the Hillary campaign, we have a strong list of Asia people. We know who they are. We know what they think. And it would have likely been a significant continuity with the past. And it's possible that in a Trump administration, you might see more continuity in Northeast Asia than we might think. But it's going to depend on who gets key appointments. It makes a big difference if John Bolton is the Secretary of State. That would have big implications for Korea compared to, let's say, a more moderate choice. And so until we see who the Secretaries of State, Defense, Treasury, USTR, and the National Security Advisor actually are, it's really difficult to say what's going to happen in the early months of a Trump presidency. Thank you very much.